Throughout human history, we've shown a remarkable talent for two things: creating beautiful art and finding increasingly creative ways to kill each other. These execution methods were carefully designed with specific purposes in mind. Some were meant to deter crime through sheer terror. Others were intended to humiliate the condemned before ending their lives. And some were just the result of particularly twisted minds having a very bad day. Understanding these methods isn't about glorifying violence, it's about understanding how power, fear, and social control have shaped human societies. It's about recognizing how far we've come, and perhaps, more importantly, ensuring we never go back. The methods we'll explore today represent the absolute extremes of judicial punishment. They were designed not just to kill, but to make the process as prolonged, painful, and public as possible. In many cases, the spectacle was just as important as the sentence itself. Our first stop on this macabre tour takes us to medieval England, where they perfected what might be the most theatrically brutal execution method ever devised: drawing and quartering. If executions were Broadway shows, this would be the equivalent of The Lion King: elaborate, expensive, and guaranteed to leave the audience speechless. The full name of this charming procedure was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and it was reserved for the crime of high treason. Basically, having the audacity to upset the king. And let me tell you, English monarchs did not handle criticism well. The process began with the condemned being dragged through the streets on a hurdle. Think of it as the world's worst parade float. This wasn't just for show, though it certainly was a show. The dragging served to roughen up the prisoner and ensure they arrived at the execution site already battered and humiliated. The crowds would line the streets, hurling everything from rotten vegetables to creative insults. It was like a medieval version of social media, but with more actual physical throwing. Once they reached the gallows, the real performance began. The condemned would be hanged, but here's the twist: not until death. Oh no, that would be far too merciful for a traitor. They'd be cut down while still conscious, still breathing, still very much aware of what was about to happen next. Imagine waking up from a nightmare, only to realize you're still in it, and it's about to get significantly worse. The next step was drawing, though not the kind you did in art class. The executioner would make an incision in the prisoner's abdomen and begin removing their entrails while they watched. The intestines would be burned before the prisoner's eyes, creating what must have been the most horrifying cooking show in history. Today, we'll be preparing fresh offal, and our special guest will be providing running commentary, whether they want to or not. But wait, there's more. The D was the quartering, literally tearing the body into 4 parts. Sometimes this was done by tying the limbs to 4 horses and having them run in opposite directions. Other times, it was accomplished with axes, which was presumably more reliable than hoping for horses would cooperate on cue. The head would be removed and, along with the quarters, displayed publicly as a warning to others. London Bridge became something of an outdoor gallery for traitors' heads. Though the art critics were notably silent on these particular exhibitions, this method was used for centuries, with some famous victims including William Wallace, yes, the Braveheart fellow, and the gunpowder plot conspirators. Guy Fawkes actually cheated the system a bit by jumping from the gallows and breaking his neck, dying before the worst parts could begin. Even in death, he managed to stick it to the establishment one last time. The last person to be sentenced to this fate was David Tyree in 1782. Though, by then, public sentiment had shifted enough that he was simply hanged until dead first. A small mercy, but mercy nonetheless. The practice was officially abolished in 1870, roughly 8 centuries too late for everyone's comfort. What made drawing and quartering particularly effective as a deterrent wasn't just its brutality, but its publicity. These executions were major social events, drawing crowds of thousands. The authorities wanted everyone to see exactly what happened to traitors, creating a shared cultural memory of consequence that would hopefully prevent future rebellions. Of course, the irony is that many of the men subjected to this punishment became folk heroes, their brutal deaths transforming them from criminals into martyrs. Sometimes the Crown's attempt at deterrence backfired spectacularly, creating legends that outlasted the very dynasties that ordered their deaths. If drawing and quartering was England's contribution to the Hall of Fame of horrible deaths, then impalement was the Eastern European entry. And let me tell you, those folks knew how to make an impression. While the English were busy with their elaborate multi-step process, the Ottomans and their neighbours preferred something more direct. And absolutely nobody did it quite like Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler, or, as he's known in popular culture, the inspiration for Dracula. Now, Vlad didn't earn his nickname by being particularly good at party planning. Between 1448 and 1476, he turned impalement into something approaching an art form. Though it's the sort of art you'd find in the darkest corners of a very disturbed museum, the method itself sounds deceptively simple. Take a large wooden stake, insert it into the condemned person, and wait. But like most things that sound simple, the devil was entirely in the details, and Vlad was nothing if not determined. The stakes used were typically 8 to 10 feet long, carefully prepared to avoid splinters. Though not out of mercy, mind you. A splintered stake might cause the victim to die too quickly from internal bleeding, and that would defeat the entire purpose. The tip would be deliberately dulled and oiled, designed to push internal organs aside rather than puncturing them immediately. This wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. The insertion was performed with surgical precision. Too sharp an angle and you'd hit vital organs immediately. Game over too soon. Too shallow and the person might actually survive and escape, which would be professionally embarrassing for an executioner. The goal was to thread the needle, so to speak, creating maximum suffering while ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. Once properly positioned, gravity would do the rest of the work. The person's own body weight would slowly force them down the stake over the course of hours, sometimes even days. Meanwhile, the stake would gradually work its way through the torso, carefully avoiding the heart and other immediately fatal organs until the very end. Vlad elevated this already nightmarish process to theatrical heights. He wouldn't just impale one person, he'd impale hundreds, sometimes thousands at once, creating what he called forests of the impaled. Picture, if you will, an entire valley filled with stakes, each bearing a slowly dying victim, their cries creating a symphony of agony that could be heard for miles. The psychological warfare aspect was brilliant in its cruelty. When Ottoman armies approached Wallachian territory, they would encounter these forests long before they reached any actual military targets. Imagine being a soldier, marching toward what you thought was a routine conquest, only to find yourself walking through what appeared to be a hellish sculpture garden where the art was still moving and screaming. The most famous of these displays occurred in 1462, when Vlad impaled 20,000 Ottoman prisoners and local criminals outside the city of Targovik. The forest was arranged in concentric circles around the city, with the most important prisoners placed on the highest stakes at the center, creating a hierarchy of horror that could be seen from miles away. The effectiveness of this psychological warfare cannot be overstated. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, The man who wasn't intimidated by massive walls or Greek fire took one look at Vlad's handiwork and decided that maybe Wallachia wasn't worth the trouble after all. He turned his entire army around and went home, proving that sometimes the best defense is a good offense, especially if your offense involves impaling 20,000 people. But Vlad wasn't just randomly cruel, he was strategically cruel. He used impalement as both punishment and deterrent, targeting not just enemy soldiers but also criminals, corrupt officials, and anyone else who threatened social order. In his twisted logic, extreme punishment would create a perfectly ordered society through sheer terror. The method wasn't unique to Vlad, of course. The Assyrians had been using impalement for centuries as their go-to method for dealing with rebellious subjects. The Romans occasionally employed it, though they preferred crucifixion for its superior public relations value. The Ottomans themselves were no strangers to the technique, having inherited it from various Byzantine and earlier traditions. What made Vlad special was the scale and the showmanship. He didn't just execute people, he created experiences, horrifying tableaux that would be remembered and talked about for centuries. Even today, more than 500 years later, we're still talking about him. Though, admittedly, he's better known now for inspiring vampire stories than for his innovative approaches to capital punishment. The practice of impalement gradually declined in Europe as more civilized methods of execution became fashionable, though it persisted in some parts of the Ottoman Empire well into the 19th century. The last recorded cases in Europe occurred in the early 1600s, though rumors persist of isolated incidents well beyond that date. Our final destination in this grand tour of human cruelty takes us back to ancient Sicily, around 560 BCE, where we encounter what might be the most diabolically creative execution device ever conceived: the brazen bull. If the previous methods we've discussed were brutal symphonies of pain, then the brazen bull was pure, concentrated evil, wrapped in bronze and disguised as public art. The story begins with Perilos of Athens, a metal worker who apparently woke up one morning and thought, "You know what the world needs? A more creative way to cook people alive." He presented his invention to Phalaris, the tyrant of Agrigentum, as the ultimate fusion of execution and entertainment. Sort of like a murderous food truck, but stationary and significantly less appetizing. The device itself was a work of craftsmanship that would have been impressive if it weren't so absolutely horrifying. Picture a life-sized bronze bull, hollow on the inside, with a door in its side and an intricate system of pipes and resonators built into its head. The attention to detail was remarkable. The bull was so realistic that from a distance you might mistake it for an actual work of art, which in a sense it was, though not the kind you'd want in your garden. The process was elegantly simple in its horror. The condemned person would be placed inside the bull through the side door, which would then be locked securely. A fire would be lit beneath the bronze beast, gradually heating the metal until the interior became an oven. The victim would literally be roasted alive. Their screams filtered through the carefully designed pipes in the bull's head to emerge as sounds resembling the bellowing of an actual bull. But here's where Perilos showed his true genius for psychological torture. The pipes weren't just designed to muffle the screams. They were tuned to transform them into what sounded like music. The dying person's agony would be converted into haunting, melodic notes that would drift across the city like some hellish concert. Citizens could enjoy an afternoon in the square, listening to what sounded like a rather avant-garde musical performance, all while someone was literally being cooked alive just a few yards away. The acoustic engineering required for this transformation was actually quite sophisticated. The pipes had to be precisely calibrated to filter out the harsh, recognizably human elements of screaming while amplifying the more musical frequencies. It was acoustic architecture at its most malevolent, turning the bull into a massive, murderous musical instrument. Phalaris was reportedly delighted with the invention, praising Paralaus for his creativity and ingenuity. He was so impressed, in fact, that he decided the inventor should have the honor of being the first person to test his own creation. There's a lesson here about the dangers of presenting dictators with new torture devices. They're likely to want a demonstration, and they're not particularly concerned about volunteer availability. The irony was perfect, really. Paralaus had created a device designed to transform human suffering into beautiful music, and he became its first composer, his own dying screams providing the inaugural performance. One imagines that as the bronze walls began to heat around him, he might have had second thoughts about his career choices. But the brazen bull story doesn't end with its creator's death. Phalaris used it regularly throughout his reign, turning public executions into cultural events. Citizens would gather to hear the bull's song, creating a community ritual around what was essentially a human barbecue. It was mass entertainment at its most disturbing, combining the Roman love of spectacle with Greek innovation in engineering. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victim. Everyone in the city would hear the bull's voice, and everyone would know exactly what it meant. The beautiful, haunting melody would serve as a constant reminder of the tyrant's power and creativity in punishment. It was marketing through terror, brand building via bronze torture device. The method spread throughout the ancient world, with various rulers commissioning their own bronze bulls. The Romans, never ones to pass up a good execution method, adopted it enthusiastically. The device became something of a status symbol among tyrants. If you didn't have your own brazen bull, you weren't really serious about being a proper despot. Historical accounts suggest that the bull was used not just for political prisoners, but also for common criminals, religious dissidents, and anyone else who happened to annoy the ruling authority. The beauty of the device, from a tyrant's perspective, was its versatility. It could accommodate anyone, regardless of their crime or social status. Truly democratic in its horror. The most famous victim after Paralaus was likely Phalaris himself. According to historical accounts, when the people of Agrigentum finally had enough of their tyrant's cruelties, they overthrew him and gave him a taste of his own medicine. The bull's final song was performed by the very man who had commissioned its creation. A fitting end to one of history's most creative monsters. The practice of using brazen bulls continued sporadically throughout the ancient world and into the medieval period. There are records of similar devices being used in medieval Europe, though by then they were more often called Iron Maidens or other names, depending on their specific design modifications. What made the brazen bull particularly insidious was how it transformed public execution from a crude display of power into something approaching art. It took the raw brutality of cooking someone alive and wrapped it in aesthetics, making the horror palatable, even enjoyable, for spectators. It was perhaps the ultimate example of how human creativity, when applied to cruelty, could produce something far worse than simple violence. The device represents a particular kind of evil genius, the ability to take something fundamentally horrible and make it beautiful, to transform suffering into art, to create community around cruelty. It's a reminder that some of humanity's greatest innovations have been applied to our darkest impulses. And there we have it, folks. A brief tour through humanity's greatest hits in the creative ways to end a life category. From the theatrical brutality of drawing and quartering to Vlad's forests of the impaled, to the musical horrors of the brazen bull, we've seen how different cultures approached the fundamental question of how to make death as unpleasant as possible. Now, you might be wondering why anyone would want to know about these historical atrocities. After all, they represent humanity at its absolute worst, the darkest corners of our collective past that we'd perhaps rather forget. But there's value in remembering these things, uncomfortable as they are. First, they remind us just how far we've come. When you're having a bad day, when modern life seems particularly challenging, remember that you live in an era where being slowly roasted alive in a bronze bull is not considered an acceptable form of justice. That's progress, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Second, they help us understand the relationship between power and cruelty throughout history. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully designed systems of control, ways for rulers to maintain authority through terror. Understanding how this worked in the past helps us recognize similar patterns when they emerge in our own time. Finally, they serve as a reminder of what happens when societies lose their moral compass, when the ends are used to justify any means, no matter how horrific. The people who devised these methods weren't monsters from fairy tales. They were human beings, just like us, who convinced themselves that extreme cruelty was not only acceptable but necessary. The good news is that these methods are largely relics of the past. The bad news is that human nature hasn't fundamentally changed. We still have the capacity for both incredible creativity and terrible cruelty. The difference is that we've built societies, laws, and institutions designed to channel our creativity toward better ends. Remember, and be grateful, that we've learned to do better. Thank you for joining us on this rather dark journey through history.